He said, I think I finally met the person I'm supposed to be with for the rest of my life. I started to fall in love with this perfect man.
All of a sudden, there was a date. They were going to get married, and it seemed like it was coming fast.
You know, they can be charming and still be a snake in the grass.
My mom called me, and she said, you know, they found your sister. She's dead.
Something in his eyes just didn't feel right.
I thought he killed her. He was the only person that made sense.
600 North Mont,
I was supremely confident that I had the right person, and he called and wanted the family to know that he did admit to killing Annette Huddle. What a shock.
A Utah man accused of murdering a California beauty queen.
The last thing on your mind is you're married to a murderer.
My mom, she's been through a lot. She was pretty much a teen mom when she had my older sister. She always said that she kind of grew up with us and she was kind of one of the kids.
1987, in Salt Lake City, Utah, 37-year-old Margie Danielson finds herself alone after 20 years of marriage.
We were just too young when we got married. That was our only problem. He had a lot of growing up to do.
Margie is uncertain she will find someone to love and trust again.
I'm sure she wanted a healthy adult relationship.
But after a year of staying home with her daughters, she decides it's time to try.
I went with some friends to a Western club, and I noticed a gentleman sitting at the bar. He was very good looking. Eventually, he came over and asked me to dance. He said his name was Sean Paul Lanier. He was very confident, very charming. He was a gentleman. Finally, it was time to go, and he said, well, how can we get to know each other better? And I said, why don't you call me and we'll talk on the phone and get to know each other. I was just trying to be really careful because I wanted to make sure this next relationship I had was going to be a good one.
Days later, Margie gets the call she was hoping for. It's Sean Paul, who invites her to dinner.
I was kind of excited to go out on my first date after all these years.
She was all dressed up, so you couldn't hug her, mess up her hair, or touch her too much to say goodbye.
Sean Paul exceeds Margie's expectations when he arrives at her door.
He had brought me red roses. It was so romantic. He told me he was a chef, that he had graduated from Cordon Bleu in Paris. He was also a bodybuilder, had these huge muscles, so I was quite impressed with him. He did tell me that he had a daughter in California, and his daughter meant everything to him. It brought me closer to him because I have daughters.
As their first date comes to a close, Sean Paul opens up with a vulnerability that Margie finds endearing.
He said that he couldn't believe the feelings he was feeling that were so strong already. He said, I think I finally met the person I'm supposed to be with for the rest of my life.
Over the next few months, Sean Paul overwhelms Margie with his attention.
He always sent flowers. It seemed like there was always flowers in the house.
We went out to dinner quite a bit. We did things with the girls.
He was fun and playful. He was nice. She seemed happy.
I started to fall in love with this perfect man.
2 months in, Sean Paul takes Margie to an exclusive health club.
And he says, guess what? I bought you and the girls a membership here. And he goes, I want to buy you workout clothes. And I said, no, that's too much. A few days later, I walk up to the house with my girls.
And we came home to a house full of workout clothes.
On each bedroom door is hanging a workout outfit and shoes down below to match. One for me and one for each of my 3 daughters. And I just froze. He did not have a key. How did he get in?
It really freaked her out, knowing that he had been in the house.
I immediately called him and said, how did you get in my house? And he said, your bathroom window was open and I wanted to surprise you because you wouldn't let me give you the workout clothes. I felt violated. And I told him, it's too much. I can't do this. I need a break.
But Sean Paul doesn't stay away for long.
One day I came home and underneath my door was a note. He said, something terrible has happened. I did call him and he was crying and he said his daughter had been in a car accident in California. Please come over, please come over. And I said, okay, I will. I walked up to his door and when he opened it, he was acting really strange. Something in his eyes just didn't feel right. I felt fear, a sick feeling. Something isn't right. And I said, no, I can't come in. And he tried to grab my arm, and I ran. And I went and got in my car, shut the door, locked it, but I felt like I had escaped.
Later, Sean Paul calls to explain.
He said, my daughter died. He said, I took it out on you. I'm so sorry. I just cried. I just couldn't even imagine losing one of my girls. So I felt really, really bad for him.
It's an emotional moment that quells Margie's fears and opens her up to a deeper connection.
That's the first time that we actually were intimate. I was really nervous because he was only the second man that I'd ever been with. But he was very romantic, very tender, very loving, and it just makes you want to melt and think everything's going to be okay. He was very good at being intimate, very good.
The relationship is rekindled, and Margie and Sean Paul pick up where they left off.
They were lovey-dovey. They were touchy and, you know, they'd kiss and we'd be grossed out by it. But they seemed fond of each other and they would show it.
Margie is proud that Sean Paul is a successful chef and even appears on a local cooking show. So money is no issue. Or is it?
He had always worn this gold chain and he didn't have it on. I said, what happened to it? And he said, I lost it. A few days later, I found a pawn slip for his necklace. And I thought, he must really be hard up.
Any doubts fade when Sean Paul proposes about a year after their first meeting.
The diamond was a heart-shaped diamond, and it was beautiful. I was so impressed with that.
All of a sudden, there was a date. They were going to get married, and it seemed like it was coming fast.
It was on Valentine's Day. He took care of all the arrangements. He found a place. He ordered the flowers.
They signed the wedding certificate and that was it. He wasn't really dressed up. So it was just kind of odd.
Sean Paul moves quickly to take control of the household finances.
For some reason, out of the blue, the fear came back. Just something telling me that something's not right again. So I went to his briefcase and I went in and I went through each document very, very, very carefully. And I noticed on his daughter's death certificate, the date she died was wrong. There's some misspelled words and there was an estate seal. So when he came home from work, I pulled out the document and I showed him and I said, look, this is wrong. And he says, I'll call him. I'm going to call the hospital where she died. We're going to take care of this.
But Margie can't leave it alone.
Something's pushing me to do this. I started finding more mistakes on different documents.
Margie confronts Sean Paul again, but he doesn't rattle. He says he can explain.
He said he was in the witness protection program under an assumed name.
And that's because he got mixed up with the mafia in New Zealand. He's in the program administered by the FBI.
And in my brain, I'm going, you are so ridiculous. But I had to pretend to believe it because I was trying to find out who he was.
Then, on March 20th, 1988, Margie gets a call from a friend, which confirms her worst fears and turns her life upside down.
She was watching the new show, America's Most Wanted.
Good evening from Washington, D.C.
On the show, they had murderers and escaped convicts.
The fugitive sought in that episode was a two-time killer from Ohio and California named Paul Mack. And the friend said, "Holy cow, this looks like your new husband."
Paul Stephen Mack has been in and out of prison throughout his life.
That's the last thing that I wanted to think my husband would be. He's my new husband. That night, I had to wait till he was sound asleep, and I very quietly got out of bed, and my heart's racing. I was so afraid that he was going to catch me. I'm going through his wallet, and I found something wrong. 2 Social Security numbers.
Margie has a sickening feeling that her husband, Sean Paul, is likely the killer and fugitive Paul Mack.
When you put them all together, I thought, this is crazy. I came real close to calling the police, but yet something told me not to. I'm going to find out who he really is.
A lot of women will never recover from being in a relationship with somebody like this. Margie turned around and went on the offensive. He underestimated her.
Coming up, Margie investigates, putting her in clear and present danger.
There was a young lady in Marion, Ohio. Annette Huddle was a secretary there. She was only 19.
I thought he killed her. He was the only person that made sense.
March 1988. Newlywed Margie Danielson is bravely investigating her husband, Sean Paul Lanier, who she believes is the fugitive featured on America's Most Wanted, named Paul Mack.
2 women are dead, and Mack is wanted for murder.
Paul Mack is a prime suspect in 2 separate unsolved murders, and Margie wants to know more about his 2 victims.
The last thing on your mind is you're married to a man who's a murderer.
The first murder occurred in Marion, Ohio, 7 years earlier in 1981.
There was a young lady, Annette Huddle. She was only 19.
She was an attractive young lady. She had just graduated from high school looking for a job. She wanted to be out. She wanted to be separate and independent.
Annette was headstrong. You couldn't tell Annette what to do. You couldn't tell Annette where to go. She was a wonderful older sister, wonderful. She was secretary at the Marion County Country Club.
I started thinking of all the things Sean Paul told me. And then I remembered he told me he'd worked at Marion Country Club.
Sean Paul working at the Marion County Country Club is a direct connection to the Annette Huddle case. Margie calls the club to learn more.
I said, I have you as a reference for Sean Paul Lanier. And she said, I've never heard of a Sean Paul Lanier. A Sean Paul Lanier has never worked here. And I wasn't sure really what to do from there.
Annette Huddle went missing 7 years earlier on July 8th, 1981.
My grandparents were taking her to work and picking her up. But the one time she called my grandparents, said, "Grandmother, never mind, I've got a ride home." She didn't come home that night. We never heard or saw from Annette again.
On the morning of July 12th, just 7 miles outside of Marion, a family canoeing on the Olentangy River are horrified when they see a body laying on the riverbank.
While I'd worked some other murder cases, this one was pretty touching. Seeing a young woman partially dressed, thrown in the river, all appearances that she was sexually assaulted and murdered. We knew this was going to be a difficult case. A news release was completed on Sunday asking for the public's help to identify this woman.
I knew it was her, and I'd never see my sister again.
It wasn't until Monday morning that her family came in and identified her. I don't know any police officer that relishes making a death notification. It's difficult.
The results from Annette's autopsy are inconclusive.
There was no gunshot wound, there were no stab marks, there was no strangulation.
Investigators interview Annette's co-workers at the Marion County Country Club, including her boss, Paul Mack. who Margie Danielson believes might be her husband, Sean Paul.
He came in, he was very cooperative, very smooth, answered all of our questions, and was generally very helpful. The last time he saw Annette Huddle was at the club, and he had no idea what had happened to her.
But Paul's co-workers tell a different story.
They all told us Paul Mack had offered to give her a ride home. Also, secondary to that was he was going to give her some marijuana, and he wanted her to come to his house.
My sister didn't like him. She came home and said, "Oh my gosh, gross. This old man at the country club is making moves on me."
Paul Mack's romantic gestures are similar to how Sean Paul would later court Margie in the early days of their relationship.
He sent her flowers. He asked her out, and she never returned any of his calls or his gestures or anything. She would even sneak out of work early so he wouldn't see her leave or know when she left. So she tried to avoid him, but with being his secretary, that was kind of hard.
For 3 months, Annette shunned Paul's advances. Then she disappeared.
And the circumstances surrounding those last few hours that they were together, that put him in the spotlight. Paul Mack was our person of interest.
And Mack becomes even more interesting when Sergeant Bailey runs his name through the system.
He was on probation in another county.
He was a convicted felon when he was hired at the Marion County Country Club. A convicted felon has no business working at a country club.
Mack was convicted of felony theft and is in current violation of his parole. He is sent back to prison, which is when Bailey gains access to his home.
The homeowner signed a consent that we could go in and actually search his home after he was in jail. We found in the fireplace that he had burnt something in there, and we saw small wooden beads that would be similar to those that would come from a macrame purse.
The beads that were found in the fireplace were similar to the beads that should have been on my sister Annette Huddle's purse.
But there were no fingerprints. There was nothing specifically that put Annette Huddle in that house. Had we gone to trial, I don't think we had enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he actually killed her.
The case stalls. 3 years later, Paul Mack is released from prison after serving time for his parole violation.
When he got out of prison, he actually went to California. His parole probation was transferred to Sacramento, California,
where Paul Mack will meet his next victim.
Karen Winslet was my younger sister. She was a very beautiful person.
She never went to modeling sessions alone, and this time she did.
Paul Mack told him, "Oh, she never showed up."
Mack's deadly pattern is to target women and use them, or kill them.
The detective believed that he murdered these women because they rejected him. It's like, if I can't have you, then nobody will.
(1981). 4 years before Margie Danielson married the man calling himself Sean Paul Lanier, Paul Mack is released from prison after serving time on a parole violation. He still hasn't faced murder charges in the Annette Huddle case.
It was just difficult, very difficult time to move this case forward. But when he got out of prison, he actually went to California, and we kept track of him.
4 years after his release, the 33-year-old Mack is on the hunt for another woman in Sacramento.
My name is Sharon Mack, and I was married to Paul Mack.
Sharon, like Salt Lake City's Margie Danielson, is a single working mom.
I was in my early 30s. I had been divorced a couple of times and was not interested in getting into another relationship.
And just like Margie 3 years later, Sharon goes out for a night of dancing with friends at a country and western bar.
Paul was there that night, and when I glanced over and noticed him, I thought, wow, he's really cute. I said, "Are you just going to stand there and look good, or are you going to dance?" He laughed and he said, "Okay, let's go." He didn't know how to dance. And that became painfully apparent about 2 seconds later, and we left the dance floor. For the first time in a long time, I took a man home with me from a bar.
Sharon has no idea she is bringing a killer home to her family.
I found Paul to be so charming. He always knew what to say. My daughter adored him. He bonded with her tremendously, and I thought he was such a good, wholesome family man. I was in love.
Less than a month after meeting Sharon, Mac is arrested on minor charges.
He told me it was because his roommate had gotten busted for growing pot in the backyard, and because he was on probation, his probation got revoked, and he was sent to the state prison.
Even from behind bars, Paul manages to charm Sharon into a deeper commitment.
He said our visitations would be easier to set up if we were a married couple, and I agreed, and I married him while he was in county jail. I have always had the attitude, and still have the attitude, that life is an adventure, so I thought I was following my heart. He sent me letters and cards on a daily basis. I would take him a little bit of money and put it on his commissary account.
Over a year later, Paul is released, and it falls on Sharon to finance their fresh new start.
I did not need to be married to anyone for financial reasons. I thought I was in love. But one day, we got into a tiff, and I went upstairs to our bedroom, thinking he'll cool his heels and he'll come apologize. That's not what happened. I was lying on the bed for maybe 10, 15 seconds, and the door came off the hinges. He charged into that room. He jumped on me. He put his hands around my neck and was choking me. My only thought was my daughter was in the other bedroom down the hall. And then as quickly as it started, it stopped. I realized that something terribly, terribly was not right with this man. I got my daughter, gathered up a few items, and I left him. And that was it. I was done.
As Sharon runs from her marriage, police in Marion, Ohio continue to check on her ex-husband. But Paul Mack stays out of trouble until 1987, when a Sacramento model mysteriously disappears. Detective Bob Bell investigates the case.
I was a homicide detective assigned to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. I was made aware of Karen Winslet's disappearance, and it seemed really kind of frightening. 21 years old, she worked at a local restaurant. She was a part-time model and a beautiful girl.
She was very geeky in 6th and 7th grade. She just went from like geek to gorgeous overnight. The more she could play with her hair and her makeup, she was down with that.
She said she had an appointment with a photographer. Actually, it was for a Budweiser photo shoot, is what she had been told. So she was kind of excited about that.
Nurses, waitresses, and models are the most common occupations among victims. Karen ticked 2 of those boxes.
When she would go for a photo shoot, she would oftentimes bring her boyfriend or someone else along.
Her boyfriend was working out of town, and her best friend was busy, and she went on her own.
Karen leaves a note for her boyfriend with the photographer's address.
I interviewed the boyfriend, and he told me that he drives out to the address listed and knocks on the door and is met inside the residence by an individual identifying himself as Paul Mack. Mack denied even knowing her or having ever heard her name. Several hours later, he gets a call from Paul Mack telling him that, yeah, he did have an appointment with her, but he canceled it.
I had a feeling in my gut. It was just ripping at me like something happened.
Coming up, Police find evidence in Paul Mack's apartment. What they don't find is Paul Mack.
Paul Mack goes on the run again. He's a womanizer, a swindler, a con man, and a psychopath.
He intended to get sexual favors from them, and when he didn't get what he wanted, he ended their lives.
But Mack's next target will risk her own life to bring him down.
And that's when I decided I could finally do something about it.
Margie Danielson has discovered that her new husband, Sean Paul, aka Paul Mack, is the prime suspect in 2 murders, the second of which took place in Sacramento in 1987. The victim was 21-year-old model Karen Winslet.
I interviewed him in his house. He was nice looking, well-groomed hair. I think he took care of himself. You could tell he had a certain arrogance about him and an ego. He invited me into the living room of his house, and sitting on the couch was a friend of his. Paul wanted someone to be a witness to the interview.
Upon entering, one thing is instantly apparent to the detective.
He had no photography equipment in his house whatsoever. When I interviewed him, he gave me an alibi that he was with his brother all that morning and that he had then gone to his hairdresser's.
A call to the hairdresser, however, arouses Bell's suspicions.
The hairdresser said, yeah, he showed up around 3:30. But the hairdresser added that on that morning, he called and canceled his 10 o'clock appointment.
After catching Mack in a lie, Bell does a background check on him.
I discovered that he had been in prison for a variety of crimes. I found out that he'd been married several times.
In fact, at least 7 times before Margie.
Ultimately, what he's wanting from them is financial gain. He's violent, he is aggressive, he's also loving and caring, but he's getting what he wants from those individuals.
This certainly rings true with both Margie and Sharon, but with the 2 victims mentioned in America's Most Wanted, Annette Huddle and Karen Winslet, there is a different commonality.
The younger women who rebuke his advances and don't give him what he wants, he ultimately puts an end to both their lives.
Karen Winslet, at the time she disappeared, was working in Sacramento as a waitress, and I believe that Paul Mack saw her there and may have struck up a conversation. But I had no proof. We had no evidence that she had come to foul play at this point. We put out the broadcast with her description of her car and her picture and everything, and asked for the public's help.
Then there's a break in the case. An electrical worker who knows Karen spots her car in a local motel parking lot.
We found her there in the back seat of her car. When you see her laying there, I got angry. That was my first response. I was angry at whoever did this.
My mom called me and she said, you know, they found your sister. She's dead. I remember dropping the phone and literally like falling to my knees.
As in the case of Annette Huddle, the medical examiner can't find any damage to the body, but the toxicology report offers an important clue.
She had took Percodan, which is a drug used by dentists for tooth pain. The pathologist indicated that she had died from a dose which was 25 times lethal.
Somebody else put them pills in her stomach. They force-fed her those pills. I knew it was Paul Mack. I knew, because he was the last person to see her.
I went and interviewed the friend that was at his house on the day that I had made contact with him. Come to find out, he was Paul Mack's dentist. I found that this dentist had overprescribed Paul Mack for some time with Percodan.
Those same pills could have been used to murder Karen Winslet.
It's not sitting right. It was enough to probably arrest him, but I wasn't certain we were going to get a conviction at that point. We had no way of putting her conclusively in his house on that day.
It's a frustration shared by Marion, Ohio's Sergeant Tim Bailey, who has never had enough evidence to charge Paul Mack in the murder of Annette Huddle 6 years earlier. He routinely checks in for updates on Paul Mack. This time, the parole officer has disturbing news.
She was like, you need to call the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office. He's involved in a case there, possible murder. Well, boy, the lights went off on that one. We hung up and we called the Homicide Division of the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office and talked to the detectives there.
Paul Mack, during this time, of course, had contacted an attorney. The attorney called me and said, okay, we're willing to surrender Paul Mack. And we're going, okay, well, that's good. Bring him on in.
Paul Mack was to show up at the sheriff's office for an interview, but he took off. The sheriff's office was looking for him.
And unfortunately, the next thing we knew, he'd fled. I didn't think he could hide under a rock. There would be somewhere we could find him, and he will show up somewhere soon.
3 months after Paul Mack flees Sacramento, Margie Danielson meets the man who will become her husband, Sean Paul, at a club in Salt Lake City. And now this man wanted for 2 murders is living with her and her daughters.
Get him away from me!
Very handsome and good looking, and I mean, who knew what was lurking inside him?
Margie has learned Sean Paul's true identity from America's Most Wanted and is now about to take action.
I decided I would try and get his fingerprints. I thought, well, I've seen that on TV before.
She's running an astounding risk.
Not everybody's going to fall victim to a psychopath, but if you underestimate them, then you have the likelihood of becoming a victim yourself.
March 1988. Margie Danielson has married and is living with a man she suspects is killer and fugitive Paul Mack.
She investigated him. She found paperwork. She figured out that he was lying.
I needed to stay and find out who this man was. I was kind of fearful the whole time I was investigating him. After we got married, every day I was afraid. Every day I was scared.
Margie feels most vulnerable when she is alone with him at night.
I tried to always be sick so I wouldn't have to sleep with him. And I don't feel well, leave me alone.
And now, she is about to make a dangerous move to confirm Sean Paul's identity beyond a reasonable doubt.
I decided I would try and get his fingerprints.
And secretly, surreptitiously, she gets a drinking glass with his fingerprints on it and takes it to a police officer and says, can you run a check on these?
She is staying in the situation, basically collecting evidence, gathering information, knowing that this person can be dangerous.
And while she risks her life to gather more evidence, Sacramento and Ohio police are hot on his trail.
We got a warrant for his arrest for murder, and I also put out a UFAP to try to locate him. Now that's an FBI term, unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, which allows him to be arrested anywhere in the United States.
At that point, the dominoes start to fall.
At the same time, Margie is trying to identify Sean Paul by obtaining his prints. The police have received a tip from the broadcast of America's Most Wanted.
It played on a Sunday night. We got hundreds of calls on people that thought they recognized Paul Mack and called in a tip.
Paul Stephen Mack has been in and out of prison throughout his life, and Mack has always drawn women into his world.
On Monday morning, I got a call from a local resident that knew Paul Mack, and she said, I understand you're looking for him. And I said, yes, we are. And she said, I know exactly where he is. She had worked with him at the country club, and they continued to correspond over the 5-year period that that he was in California. The information she provided was that he was in Salt Lake City. And he had a TV show on out there as a chef.
Okay, now that we've got the butter good and hot, the butter and oil mixture.
So he had the nerve to go on television, even though he's wanted, and he knows he's wanted.
Most of the time, these individuals are not afraid of getting caught because they think they're smarter and better than law enforcement.
He was certain that he could avoid detection by virtue of the fact that he had changed his appearance. I called personally the homicide detective for the Salt Lake City Police Department, and he said, well, give me some prints. They were available on his FBI rap sheet because he'd been arrested in so many other locations. He called me back about a couple hours later, and he says, well, guess what, Bob? We got a thumbprint, and it's off of a pawn slip that Paul Mack had pawned some jewelry or something.
So they were able to do a fingerprint comparison and determine it was our suspect.
I immediately told him, well, do me a favor, have someone set up on the house, make sure we don't lose him, and I will get on the next flight to Salt Lake City.
The following day, Margie looks outside her window and sees something that makes her heart race.
There was a car parked kitty corner from my house with 2 men, and next thing I know, Sean Paul, he's jumping out the window.
The SWAT team had witnessed him exiting the house, getting into his car, and driving away. So instead of losing him, they went ahead and effected a vehicle stop and took him into custody. He was described by them as being very casual, not concerned, and they had booked him into the Salt Lake City Police Department at jail.
That day, he called me and said, I'm being arrested. And I said, what for? And he goes, I don't know. That night, I didn't sleep. I tore off all the sheets in the bed and took it out and put it in the garbage.
Detectives bring Margie in for questioning and confirm what she knows deep in her gut.
Sean Paul Lanier, my husband, was actually Paul Mack, who was wanted for murder. He had looked so different. He had put on a lot of weight. He had been a bodybuilder. He was using steroids, I found out. And he wanted to look different, and he definitely did. I found out that not only was I not his second wife, but I was his 8th wife.
Paul Mack is charged with the murder of Karen Winslet and held for questioning about Annette Huddle.
So you had nothing to do with the death of the girl here, and you had nothing to do with the death back in Marion with Huddle?
I don't kill people, I don't hurt people.
A Utah man accused of murdering a California beauty queen.
Paul Mack waived extradition.
He faces trial for the murder of 21-year-old Karen Winslet.
On March 23, 1988, Paul Mack is arrested and charged for the murder of 21-year-old Karen Winslet and questioned about the murder of 19-year-old Annette Huddle.
Yes, you're trying to make it look like some kind of serial killer that went all over the country and killed.
Nah, we're not trying to make you look like a serial killer or anything else. What we're trying to do is our job.
Convict somebody like me in a case like this in the media, which they've already done.
While Paul Mack remained free, he presented a risk to any women like Margie Danielson and Sharon Mack, who were in his orbit.
He is all about controlling his victims getting what he wants and then throwing them away like trash.
I was glad he was caught. The two girls, Karen and Annette, they both rejected his advances. And I think that's why he murdered them, pure evil. I flew to California to testify in the trial. I was really nervous.
The trial lasts 3 weeks, culminating when Mack himself testifies.
His explanation for her death is that she actually tried to seduce him. He rejected her, and in this despondent state of despair and depression, Karen actually took the drugs that he brought to the scene and overdosed. This is someone who refuses to take personal responsibility. That's a hallmark of people like Paul Mack.
After 3 weeks of deliberations, the jury convicts Mack, and he is sentenced to 25 years for the first-degree murder and rape of Karen Winslet.
That was my only sister. She was never able to get married. She never was able to have kids. I mean, she didn't get to do any of the things that she wanted to do with her life that was her God-given right to do because of Paul Mack.
As for Annette Huddle, prosecutors can't produce enough forensic evidence to make murder charges stick.
This is my beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sister. I miss her every day, every hour, every minute, and I'll never stop looking for answers for her.
Sometimes I've had a little bit of guilt because I survived and these beautiful young girls didn't. And they'll always be in my heart, that's for sure.
But Margie gets some comfort from knowing she risked her life to discover Paul Mack's true identity. After the trial, she meets Sharon Mack, and they bond immediately.
We had a lot of things in common, and that made me feel good that I had someone I could talk to and someone that could relate to what I'd been through. We would send letters to the parole board every year. We did not want to see him get out because we knew nothing would change. He would still murder young girls.
In 2018, Paul Mack dies alone in prison at the age of 71. Frustrating investigators, his death leaves the case of Annette Huddle unresolved.
There was no chance of a confession, and certainly didn't look like there was any forensics that were going to come along, certainly during my career, that was going to actually give an official close to this case.
Until now. During the making of this documentary, 2 years after the death of Paul Mack, Sheriff Bailey receives incredible news and announces it during our interview with him.
I received a call from Paul Mack's attorney who represented him in California, and he told me that he wanted me and he wanted particularly the family to know that Paul Mack confessed to killing Annette Huddle before he died.
I'm honestly kind of speechless.
Boy, what a surprise. I've never had that happen before. For us, that puts the case officially closed. What a shock.
I was thrilled for the Huddle family. They wanted that and deserved it.
Paul Mack almost evaded justice. Now, his story serves as a cautionary tale.
We were victims, vulnerable ladies who just want to feel loved and hugged and important and cared for. That was part of his con.
You know, they can be charming and still be a snake in the grass. Just be super careful. Don't let any man manipulate you, scare you, or threaten you in any way.
Guys like him are so good at what they do. You don't think you can be taken, but believe me, this man could go anywhere and convince anyone to do anything. He was that good. Listen to your instincts. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right.